Why it was terrible to survive the plague. A medieval success story. So, you survived the Black Death. Congratulations. You've defied the odds, outrun a microbe, and buried half your village. You've even managed to keep breathing, although the smell in the streets might make you reconsider. But before we get to all the reasons why that was a thoroughly unpleasant turn of events, let's begin, very slowly, with a question. Who exactly were the people that survived one of the deadliest pandemics in human history? Turns out that the answer is both depressingly arbitrary and vaguely hopeful. The Black Death, as it came to be known centuries later, swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351. It killed somewhere between 30% and 60% of the population. Entire towns disappeared. And yet, some people didn't die. These people were, statistically speaking, the exception. But in a medieval world obsessed with God's favor and moral purpose, surviving something everyone else succumbed to didn't necessarily feel like a win. Let's meet our unlikely band of plague survivors. Spoiler: none of them are having a good time. Immunity, isolation, and luck. Mostly luck. First, let's talk about immunity. Some modern studies suggest that a rare genetic mutation, called CCR5 delta 32, might have protected a very small number of people from contracting the plague. This gene interferes with the entry of certain pathogens into white blood cells, and while its connection to the Black Death is still debated, it's a tantalizing possibility that some survivors carried a built-in medieval cheat code. Of course, no one at the time knew this. If you didn't die, people didn't assume you were genetically special. They assumed you were suspiciously lucky, or spiritually guilty. Then there were those who simply weren't in the wrong place at the wrong time. Isolation, accidental or intentional, saved lives. If you happened to be a solitary shepherd high in the Pyrenees, or a monk in a hermit cell, congratulations. The rest of the world was burning, but you were socially distant before it was fashionable. Some fled cities as the plague rolled in. The wealthier you were, the more likely you could afford to escape. Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio described nobles fleeing to their country estates outside Florence, essentially taking a long, terrified vacation from the apocalypse. This might sound like a savvy move, but it wasn't foolproof. The plague didn't need a passport. It traveled on fleas, rats, and even the garments of the infected. Some brought death with them to their remote sanctuaries, spreading the joy further. And then there were those who stayed put and somehow didn't die. Maybe they lived on the edge of a town that got wiped out. Maybe their local flea population was less enthusiastic about biting humans. Maybe divine intervention, if you asked the church. But let's be honest, it was probably just luck. Grim, arbitrary, disinterested luck. Surviving plague, medieval style. What did it mean to be a survivor in the 14th century? It wasn't exactly a medical victory lap. There were no vaccine cards, no triumphant return to the office. Surviving the plague didn't imply recovery so much as endurance. Some lived through the disease itself, sweating, vomiting, delirious with fever, praying or cursing in equal measure. Bubonic plague symptoms were excruciating: swollen, blackened lymph nodes, buboes, vomiting blood, and a stench that could knock over a healthy ox. If you lived through that, it wasn't because of expert care. Doctors either fled, or showed up in bird masks full of herbs and prayed harder than you did. Others simply never contracted it. These were the real anomalies. But again, in a time where cause and effect were mostly guesses, their survival only raised suspicions. Why you? What did you do? Who did you pray to? Did you drink something unusual? It's worth noting that religious explanations were popular. Some thought the survivors were blessed. Others thought they had made some sort of unsavory pact. This led to deeply unfortunate consequences, including the widespread persecution of Jews, lepers, and anyone considered different. Accusations of well poisoning and heresy swirled alongside the miasma of rotting bodies. Survivors were often too scared or grief-stricken to care much about justice. Alone together, what it felt like. Imagine walking through a town square, where no market stalls are open, no laughter rings out, and every second door is nailed shut. That's your new world. The people you loved are mostly gone. The rhythms of life, work, worship, celebration, have all collapsed. And somehow, you're still here, eating stale bread in silence. Chroniclers of the time tried to put words to this shell shock. One account from Sina reads, father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Survival was a lonely thing. It didn't bring clarity. It brought questions. What now? Was it over? Were you safe? And if you were safe, did that mean something or nothing? In literature, plague survivors didn't fare much better. Boccaccio's Decameron opens with 10 young people fleeing Florence to tell each other stories, while the city dies behind them. It's entertainment, yes, but also a form of denial. Survivors were constantly torn between horror and distraction, between the sacred and the absurd. Not a gift, a sentence. In modern narratives, surviving a disaster often implies a new beginning. For the medieval survivor, it was more like being left behind. You hadn't escaped the plague, you just outlived it, and now you had to pick through the wreckage. Fewer people meant more land, more food, more opportunity eventually. But in 1351, right after the final waves had passed, all you had was empty streets, plague pits, and the creeping suspicion that the world you knew was never coming back. And you weren't wrong. You wake up, it's quiet, unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing on your chest. The Black Death has finally loosened its grip on your village, your city, your continent. You've survived, somehow. But if you were hoping for a moment of peace, or even a sense of relief, I regret to inform you the worst part may have just begun. This is the moment after the terror, after the loss. This is the moment where the survivors look around and realize what's left. Spoiler, not much. You've returned, not to life as it was, but to something unrecognizable, uncanny, and barely functioning. Let's take a very slow and thoroughly depressing walk through the immediate aftermath of the plague. Empty homes, silent streets, and no one to answer. When a third to half of your population dies in the span of a few years, the impact isn't metaphorical, it's physical. You can see it. Streets that once echoed with gossip and goat hooves are silent. Market stalls are overturned. Doorways are sealed with crude crosses. And behind many of those doors, corpses. You pass your neighbor's house. You used to argue about chickens. Now no one lives there. You try the baker's stall. No bread. The baker died last winter. His apprentice took ill the week after. You make your way to the church. The priest is gone too. No mass today or tomorrow. You are not living in a city anymore. You are wandering through a graveyard of walls and roofs. The collapse of daily life. In a pre-industrial society, daily life relies on bodies, human bodies, doing very physical things. Farming, smithing, herding, weaving, praying. When half those bodies disappear, the system doesn't just slow down, it stops. Entire sectors of life went dark. Food shortages became rampant, not because food wasn't available, but because there weren't enough people to harvest, transport, and sell it. Carts sat empty in the fields. Oxen wandered aimlessly. Fruit trees bore rotting gifts for no one. There were fewer wars. Briefly, fewer laws enforced, fewer goods made, and far, far fewer people who knew how to make anything at all. In some regions, towns that lost too many essential workers were simply abandoned. No one fixed the mills. No one maintained the roads. No one remembered who was supposed to collect taxes, and fewer still cared to pay them. Bodies still everywhere. Contrary to popular belief, the Black Death didn't inspire a single, massive wave of corpses neatly buried. What it left behind was inconsistent horror. Some cities buried the dead in mass graves quickly, fearing disease and damnation. Others ran out of space, people, and willpower. The result, many survivors walked through streets with unburied remains. Sometimes it was skeletal, sometimes it was recent. The plague pits, those infamous deep holes, where dozens or hundreds of bodies were dumped, were not always sealed well. Rain, animals, erosion, they didn't help. In the countryside, isolated homes were even worse. A family of 5 might die, and no one would know for months. By the time someone did, they'd often close the door and keep walking. The practicalities of death exceeded the abilities of the living. Fear didn't die with the plague. You might expect that once the disease faded, fear would fade too. But it didn't. The trauma of the plague lingered, not just as memory, but as policy, behavior, and worldview. People distrusted everyone. Travelers were suspect. Strangers were threats. Anyone coughing was cause for alarm. Understandably so. Remember, the plague came back in waves for centuries. Communities that used to welcome pilgrims now barred them. Cities set up quarantine zones. Some ports refused ships entirely. And people, those few left, began to cling to their personal safety with the kind of nervous rigidity that makes collective rebuilding almost impossible. Some people coped with the new world through isolation, others through religion, others through vice. All were equally unproductive, but very medieval. A sudden lack of rules. The Black Death did more than remove people. It removed rules. With entire hierarchies decimated, survivors often found themselves in a strange, dangerous freedom. The local lord might be dead, the bishop gone, the sheriff missing. That meant no one to enforce the law or collect the rent. This led to temporary anarchy in many places. Some people took over land they didn't own. Others looted churches, raided abandoned homes, or claimed entire streets as their own domain. Moral codes were as decayed as the city gates. In one account from France, peasants squatted in noble manners and declared themselves new masters. It didn't last long, but for a moment, chaos reigned comfortably. Of course, those with real power, the ones who survived in castles or on country estates, would eventually come back to restore the order they liked best, the kind where they were in charge, and everyone else remembered their place. But for a brief, unsettling moment, there were no places, just empty space, grief without ritual, another quiet catastrophe. No one had time to grieve properly. Funerals, where they happened at all, were brief and grim. Priests were in short supply. Bodies piled up too fast. Mass burials became common. Ceremonies disappeared. Bells no longer rang for the dead because the bell ringer was also dead. For a medieval Christian, this was more than emotionally difficult. It was spiritually terrifying. The idea that you or your loved ones might not be buried properly, might not receive last rites, might not be remembered in prayers, was tantamount to eternal peril. And for the survivors, there was simply no time to process the loss. The plague was not one death. It was hundreds, maybe thousands. It was unrelenting. And the mind, rather than breaking, often just shut down. People went numb. They had to. A hollow kind of survival. If you survived the plague, you weren't necessarily better off. You were left with too much food, and no one to eat it with. Too much space and no one to share it. Too many memories, and too little context for them. Your life, your work, your faith, none of it made sense anymore. The people who defined your world were gone, and the social map had been burned. Every familiar street now led to an unfamiliar silence. Every face in the crowd was missing, and it was only the beginning. Imagine walking out of your house and realizing that most of the people you've ever known are dead. Your town is half empty, the churches are closed, and the last thing you ate may have come from the hands of a corpse. You've lived through a disaster, but you're not quite alive in the way you used to be. You're not mourning a single person, you're mourning the world. This is not a story about mental health recovery. This is medieval Europe. No Buddhists asking how you're doing. There are no therapists, no support groups, no grief counselors handing out comforting words and herbal tea. What there is silence, confusion, superstition, and a soul-deep kind of fatigue that doesn't have a name, but probably should. Trauma without a framework. Today we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but in the 14th century, there was no such vocabulary. The medieval mind didn't separate the emotional from the spiritual, so when people found themselves unable to eat, sleep, or speak without breaking down, they didn't say they were traumatized. They said they were cursed, or possessed, or simply being tested by God. Of course, many survivors simply didn't talk about it at all. They were too busy, trying to eat, too scared to speak, or too numb to care. The silence after the plague wasn't just because so many people were gone. It was because those who remained didn't know what to say, and if they did, no one would listen. The lonely madness of survivors. One of the least discussed effects of the plague is what you might call survivor's madness. The intense loneliness, the guilt, the fear that you were spared for some unfathomable reason, or worse, that you had done something wrong by surviving. People cracked. Some wandered off into the woods and were never seen again. Others sat in church pews for hours without moving, long after Mass had stopped. A few became obsessed with death, spending their days carving skulls, collecting bones, or reciting funeral rites to empty rooms. Chroniclers noted these behaviors with a strange mix of pity and resignation. In Florence, one man reportedly dug his own grave and lay in it every afternoon, just in case. In Avignon, A woman kept dressing a corpse in new clothes each day, convinced her husband would wake up again if he looked presentable enough. These weren't just eccentricities. They were symptoms of profound psychological rupture, played out without explanation or relief. Guilt and the medieval conscience. Survivor's guilt wasn't a modern invention either. Medieval people believed deeply in divine punishment. If the plague was God's judgment, then what did it mean to survive it? Were you forgiven, or were you being kept alive for further punishment? This question haunted survivors. Many threw themselves into religious flagellation, literally whipping themselves in public as penance. The flagellant movement, already a fringe practice, exploded after the plague. Men and women walked in circles through towns, bleeding openly, chanting miserably, trying to earn forgiveness for sins they couldn't name. Others took the opposite approach. They gave up entirely. After all, if God could kill the innocent and leave you alive, what was the point of anything? Morality unraveled. Some chroniclers noted a rise in theft, violence, and what they described as mortal apathy. That's medieval for emotional shutdown. Children of the plague. Perhaps the most tragic cases were the youngest. Children who had grown up during the plague, or were born just after, entered a world where normal no longer existed. Some were orphaned, others half feral, and many traumatized in ways they couldn't express. Imagine being 7 years old and learning how to avoid corpses before you learn how to read, or watching your entire family die in a week, and then being raised by strangers who might also disappear. These children grew into adults who had no clear sense of tradition, no stable homes, and often no desire to build either. We call them the generation that forgot how to live. They had seen too much, too young, and the emotional scars they carried would help shape the century that followed, one marked by paranoia, violence, and deep distrust. Art that weeps and screams. Medieval art after the plague becomes noticeably darker. Skulls, skeletons, and decaying bodies start appearing not just in religious warnings, but in daily decoration. The dance of death motif, in which skeletal figures pull people of all classes into the grave, becomes popular across Europe. It's as if the survivors needed to keep death close, not to remember it, but because they couldn't forget. Some saw these images as reminders to repent. Others saw them as honest depictions of the truth, that everyone dies, no one escapes, and life is an accident. The optimism of earlier medieval art, gold leaf saints and orderly heavens, gave way to a more grim, more uncertain world. In literature too, the tone shifted. Fewer tales of chivalry, more stories of futility, betrayal, and decay. Art didn't heal the wounds, it made them visible. No language for grief. One of the most unsettling things about surviving the Black Death was how few words existed for what people were feeling. Medieval Latin had terms for sin, for guilt, for confession, but not for trauma, not for anxiety, not for the kind of sustained, shapeless dread that clings to survivors long after the event is over. So people turned to metaphors. They described themselves as empty houses, as broken vessels, as ships without sails. Monks wrote of night without stars. Mothers wrote lullabies with no hope. There was beauty in this sadness, yes, but no comfort. No one came to tell them it would be okay, because it wouldn't be. Rebuilding without a foundation. Even as towns began to reopen, fields to be tilled, and markets to resume, the survivors didn't return to life as it was. They entered a kind of half-life, going through the motions of existence, in a world they no longer trusted. What happens when your entire worldview, your family, your faith, your future, is shattered? In the 14th century, you didn't get therapy. You got silence, or sermons, or suspicion. You either found a way to keep walking, or you didn't. And this is what we mean by psychological fallout. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's slow, heavy, and invisible. And in the case of the Black Death, it didn't just affect individuals. It affected the entire medieval psyche. It lingered for generations. And some would argue, it never really went away. Let's talk about logistics, because while the Black Death was undeniably a spiritual and emotional catastrophe, it was also a practical one. People died. A lot of people. But bodies don't disappear on their own. Someone has to bury them. Someone has to clean up. Someone has to restore order. But in 14th century Europe, that someone was probably dead. Welcome to the period after the plague, where towns still reeked of decay. Streets were ankle deep in waste, and the only available workforce was a few traumatized farmers and a child with a shovel. Burying the dead, the first crisis. Let's begin with the obvious. When a town loses 40% of its population in a few months, the graveyards fill up fast. Medieval cemeteries weren't designed for mass death. They were holy, finite spaces. People expected to be buried near churches, in consecrated soil, ideally with a priest present in family mourning. During the plague, none of that was possible. Grave diggers were among the first to die. They worked close to the sick, handling corpses every day. The same went for priests, monks, and undertakers, which meant that as death accelerated, the infrastructure of burial collapsed. Cities resorted to plague pits, mass graves dug outside the city walls, sometimes hundreds of feet wide and dozens of feet deep. Bodies were piled on top of each other, sometimes with lime, sometimes with a prayer, sometimes with nothing at all. When space ran out, or when digging became too dangerous, bodies were left where they fell, in beds, in homes, in carts, on steps, in ditches. The dead outnumbered the living, and no one knew what to do. The smell. Every account from the period mentions the smell. It's hard to imagine today, in a world of sanitation and sealed trash, just how omnipresent and horrifying that odor must have been. Decomposition is a natural process, but in a medieval city with open sewers, no refrigeration, and thousands of unburied bodies, it was also a civic crisis. The stench filled churches, homes, and lungs. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of a fetid odor that seemed to burn the nostrils and darken the air. People tried to fight it. They burned incense. They carried flowers. Doctors stuffed herbs into their beak-shaped masks. But it didn't help. In many cities, the smell alone was enough to convince people to flee, if they hadn't already. Clean up. What clean up? Once the plague wave passed, the survivors faced a problem. Filth. Not metaphorical filth. Literal, knee-deep, disease-breeding filth. With no labor force and no municipal government functioning properly, everything decayed. Waste piled up. Animals ran wild. Broken carts blocked roads. Abandoned homes collapsed. There were no janitors, no garbage collectors, no servants in many households. No one left to clean the privy. No one left to boil the water. Cities and towns turned into husks, dirty, chaotic, and crawling with the remnants of the dead. In some places, attempts were made to hire workers to clean up, but there were problems. First, there weren't many workers. Second, no one wanted the job. Handling plague remnants was still terrifying. And third, many of the people who did take the jobs didn't last long, either because they got sick, or because they realized no amount of money was worth shoveling body parts. Who got the job done? Eventually, people did start cleaning, but not the nobles, not the scholars. It was the lowest classes who shouldered the mess: beggars, criminals, anyone desperate enough to trade dignity for bread. In some towns, city officials granted pardons to prisoners in exchange for burying bodies and hauling waste. They wore rags soaked in vinegar. They burned their clothes afterward. Some demanded hazard pay. Others disappeared into the work and were never seen again. In rural areas, it was even worse. Whole villages lost all their adults, and the cleanup fell to children, elderly survivors, or itinerant laborers. These efforts were patchy, uneven, and often futile. Disease lingered. Rats flourished. Water sources remained contaminated, but slowly, grimly. The worst was covered over, never fully cleaned, just concealed. Animals in charge. While humans died in droves, animals didn't necessarily follow. Some species suffered. Pigs, for instance, caught the plague in some areas, but others thrived in the vacuum of human activity. Stray dogs and feral cats roamed city streets, scavenging from the dead. Cows wandered from fields into towns. Horses pulled empty carts. Most ominously, rats multiplied, and the fleas on those rats. They were still carrying the plague. Survivors couldn't control them. With so few people left to maintain order, the balance between civilization and wilderness tilted precariously. Cities that had once been bustling trade centers now resembled ruined zoos. Water, waste, and disease. Water was another disaster. Wells were contaminated by runoff from plague pits and household waste. Rivers carried more than fish. Every bucketful risked exposure to something worse. People knew the water wasn't safe, but had no alternatives. Boiling helped, but not everyone bothered. And the idea of microscopic pathogens wouldn't appear for another 400 years. Instead, people blamed bad air, demons, or punishment from above. With human waste clogging the streets and water undrinkable, the second wave of disease began, not the plague, but typhoid, dysentery, and other infections that thrived in filth. Some towns actually lost more people in the aftermath due to these secondary outbreaks. The new normal smelled terrible. So, what did survival look like in this brave new world? It smelled like rot. It felt like ash. It looked like an abandoned alley full of bones and cats. For many survivors, especially those in cities, this was the true horror, the absence of order. Not just moral order or spiritual certainty, but literal, physical order. No clean hands, no fresh bread, no one to open the shutters or wash the linens. The world didn't just mourn the dead, it sat in their mess. And cleaning up wasn't a triumph. It was punishment. Long, unrewarding, thankless punishment for the sin of still being alive. Congratulations. You survived the plague. You didn't die in a ditch. You didn't lose your mind. Not completely. And you're now standing in what used to be a bustling medieval village. There are a lot fewer people, a lot more rats, and, surprise, someone just offered to pay you actual money to do something. Because, for the first time in centuries, you're not disposable, you're labor, and labor is suddenly very rare. This is where things start to get weird. And by weird, I mean deeply unfair, occasionally violent, and filled with enough economic chaos to make your local landlord twitch in his sleep. Welcome to the medieval labor crisis, where the peasants tried to rise, the lords tried to push back, and everybody ended up miserable, a workforce wiped out. Let's talk numbers. Before the plague, Europe's population was already under pressure. Food shortages, wars, and bad weather had taken their toll. Then the Black Death arrived and killed somewhere between 30% to 60% of the population depending on the region. That wasn't just tragic, it was catastrophic for the economy. Every village, manor, and city relied on bodies, to farm, to spin wool, to drive carts, to brew beer, to carry messages, to build walls, to maintain the endless ticking machine of medieval society. And now half the gears were gone. For landowners, this was a nightmare. Their fields were rotting, their tenants were dead, their taxes were vanishing. They couldn't harvest crops or collect rents, or enforce feudal duties if no one was left to do them. For the survivors, mostly peasants, it was kind of amazing. Suddenly, peasants had power. Here's the thing, if there are only 3 people left in your village, who know how to thatch a roof, they get to name their price. If you're the only surviving cowherd for 20 miles, you can start demanding actual wages. And people did. Survivors began refusing to work for free. They negotiated. They moved to other towns for better offers. Some even quit the land they were legally bound to, which, before the plague, would have been unthinkable. In many places, laborers doubled or tripled their wages almost overnight. Agricultural workers, in particular, were suddenly as rare and precious as gold. Fields couldn't be left fallow forever, and the surviving nobles, clergy, and merchants needed people to work them, which meant, for the briefest moment in time, peasants held the upper hand. The ruling class hates this one trick. Naturally, the people in charge weren't thrilled. Enter the emergency legislation. Governments across Europe began passing frantic laws to stop this new behavior. In England, the 1351 Statute of Labours made it illegal for workers to ask for higher wages than they had received before the plague. Yes, you heard that correctly. They tried to freeze wages in a post-apocalyptic economy. Workers who demanded more could be fined, jailed, or forcibly returned to their employers. Landlords were given the power to chase down and punish runaway serfs. Cities tried to restrict movement, and anyone caught idling or refusing lawful labor could be declared a criminal. Spoiler, this didn't work. The rise of the free worker. Despite the laws, many workers realized they had something better than legal permission. They had leverage. Lords needed them more than they needed the lords. And so began one of the most important, if least romanticized, changes in medieval history, the slow rise of the free labor. People left their manors. They wandered. They bargained. They became itinerant workers, working for whoever paid best, living in towns, and forming early forms of trade identity. that would eventually lead to guilds and wage-based economies. Feudalism didn't collapse overnight, but it cracked. The social contract of obligation, you work the land, I protect you, was eroding. After all, who needs protection when half the threats are dead, and the land is empty? Lords throw a tantrum. Of course, the elites didn't go down without a fight. Many tried to reinforce old obligations. They demanded forced labor. They sued peasants for breaking tenancy agreements. In some cases, they sent armed men to forcibly retrieve runaway workers. But the world had changed. Fear of death made people braver. The promise of higher wages made them bolder. And sometimes, it led to revolt. The peasants' revolt, and others. In 1381, just 3 decades after the first wave of the plague, England exploded. The peasants' revolt, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, wasn't just about taxes or laws. It was about freedom. It was the result of decades of resentment, of lords trying to turn back the clock, and peasants refusing to go quietly. The revolt was crushed, eventually, but it sent a message. Across Europe, similar tensions simmered. In France, in Italy, in the German states, uprisings flared, some over labor, some over taxation, many over the deep sense of injustice that had settled over the land. Survivors didn't just want to live, they wanted dignity, and the ruling class wanted everything to go back to the way it was. Guess who won? Neither. Inflation, chaos, and the broken economy. In the wake of all this labor upheaval, prices fluctuated wildly. In some areas, grain became unaffordable. In others, rents collapsed. Coinage lost value. Bartering made a comeback. Land changed hands quickly. Families rose and fell with alarming speed. The old certainties, land equals wealth, labor equals obligation, the poor stay poor, no longer applied. Survivors navigated a broken economy, full of both opportunity and ruin. Some peasants bought land for the first time. Others were evicted by ambitious merchants. It was, to put it politely, a mess. Survivors paid the price. At first, being alive made you valuable. But as new generations were born and the population began to stabilize, that window closed. Laws stayed in place. Wages stagnated again, and the brief empowerment of laborers gave way to new forms of exploitation. Survivors who had taken advantage of the labor crisis were often punished later. Contracts were rewritten. Land grants were revoked. And the social mobility they had tasted was once again restricted, this time with even more surveillance. Being a worker was never easy, but for that brief moment after the plague, it came with a strange, dangerous power. And in the end, as usual, the system closed its jaws again. Let's say you made it through the worst of the plague. You've managed to find food. You've even secured a place to sleep that isn't full of rats or unburied corpses. But there's still one huge, haunting problem. You're alone. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally, alone. Your spouse is gone. Your children, if you had any, are gone. Your siblings, cousins, neighbors, friends, gone. Entire family trees cut off in a single season. Entire villages without a single surviving elder. Entire generations of potential marriages that never happened. If you survived the plague, there's a good chance you are now an orphan, a widow, or both. And in a world built on inheritance, marriage alliances, and multi-generational households, this wasn't just sad. It was socially catastrophic. Children with no one. Let's start with the orphans. Thousands of them. In towns, cities, and countryside alike, children were left parentless, many within days. And unlike modern societies, there were no social services, no orphanages, no child welfare programs, no organized adoption agencies. What happened to these kids? A few were taken in by relatives, if any still existed. Others were absorbed into church institutions, but space was limited. Many became beggars. Many more became laborers, sometimes indentured, sometimes outright enslaved. Some were raised by strangers, not out of compassion, but utility. A child could work. A child could herd goats. A child could scrub pots. In a world desperate for hands, even tiny ones would do. But these weren't Dickensian stories of resilience. They were stories of neglect, abuse, and constant hunger. Orphans were pitied in sermons, but rarely helped. And they carried the plague's legacy in their bodies, malnourished, traumatized, unschooled, and unprotected. widows without options. Then there were the widows. Before the plague, a woman's social standing depended heavily on her marital status. To be married meant stability, usually, property access, occasionally, and protection, theoretically. To be widowed, especially young, was often devastating. After the plague, widowhood exploded, and with so many dead husbands and sons, the demographic balance shifted. In some regions, there were 2 or 3 women for every surviving man. That sounds like a setup for romance. It wasn't. Many widows found themselves legally trapped. If their husband had owned the land, they might lose it to a male heir, or to the lord. If they had dowries, some lord seized them. If they had children, they had to fight to keep custody. Widows were often blamed for their own misfortunes, either spiritually, God's punishment, or socially, she must be done something wrong. A few remarried, but most did not, especially if they were older, poorer, or lacked connections. And in a society where economic survival hinged on marriage, that made them extraordinarily vulnerable. Marriage market collapse. Let's talk numbers. In pre-plague society, marriages were planned carefully, based on dowries, land, lineage, and local availability. After the plague, all those delicate systems imploded. There simply weren't enough people. Families that once arranged marriages years in advance were now gone. Eligible spouses were dead. Entire villages no longer had enough couples to reproduce, and the survivors were scattered. The result? A marriage recession. Fewer weddings, fewer children. In some places, there's a noticeable birth rate drop decades after the plague, not because people weren't trying, but because society's basic matchmaking machinery had broken down. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of trust. Who would raise children in a world this unstable? Who would risk starting over, when everything might collapse again? Social mismatch. Another problem, survivors were demographically mismatched. In many places, the young survived more often than the old. In others, whole family groups died together. This led to bizarre generational gaps, towns full of teens with no elders, or elderly widows with no adult children. Marriage pools became uneven. Inheritance lines tangled. Women in their 20s couldn't find surviving men in their age bracket. Younger men had no elders to guide them into property or professions. Social hierarchies, once built on intergenerational support, teetered. In short, dating was hard. And not just because everyone smelled like smoke and despair. Emotional fallout of losing family. Let's be clear. Medieval people loved their families. They married for love more often than were taught. They grieved hard. They sang lullabies. They passed down stories, recipes, and heirlooms. They were not emotionally stunted caricatures. So when their families were ripped away from them, they broke. Not just socially, not just economically, but spiritually. Widows were known to wear mourning for years. Some never took off their black veils. Orphans clung to relics, a mother's rosary, a father's tool. Men built shrines to lost wives. Women left food out for ghost children. Communities told stories about loved ones they'd never see again. This wasn't just grief. It was cultural disintegration. Women and the workload. Ironically, the labor shortage and widow boom gave some women new roles, especially in urban areas. Widows took over businesses. They ran inns, workshops, breweries. Some became powerful in local economies, not because society suddenly empowered women, but because there was no one else. Yet this autonomy was unstable. It was tolerated more than accepted. As soon as a brother, uncle, or male rival returned, many women were pushed aside, and any hint of impropriety, a widow spending her own money, wearing color, laughing, was met with suspicion or scorn. Still, for a brief, unusual moment, some women shaped the post-plague economy in quiet, essential ways. Broken families, broken futures. What does it mean to lose the idea of family? For medieval survivors, it meant more than loneliness. It meant instability. Land couldn't be passed on. Children couldn't be cared for. Elders had no one to bury them. Customs eroded. The future became a question mark. Survivors didn't just mourn who had died. They mourned the life they were supposed to have lived, the spouse they were supposed to grow old with, the child they were supposed to raise, the parent they were supposed to care for. And that kind of loss doesn't go away. It lingers. It shapes your choices. It haunts the next generation. So you survived the plague. Your neighbors are dead. Your family's gone. The streets smell like a compost heap full of ghosts. But at least there's more food for you now, right? Well, sort of. In theory, fewer people meant less competition for resources. In theory, more land was available. In theory, survivors could just walk into abandoned homes, eat the pickled fish, and live like royalty. But as with all medieval things, the reality was more moldy turnip than roasted swan, because while the dead no longer needed food, the systems that produced it had also collapsed. So if you were imagining a post-apocalyptic medieval feast, think again. You're not dining like a king, you're scavenging like a rat. Farms without farmers. Let's start at the root of the problem. Labor. Farming in the 14th century was backbreaking work. It wasn't mechanized. It wasn't streamlined. It required humans, lots of them, to plow fields, to sow seed, to weed, harvest, store, and transport. And suddenly, half the people who used to do that weren't doing anything at all because they were dead. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, entire harvests were lost simply because no one was there to gather them. Grain rotted in the field. Orchards went unpicked. Livestock wandered off or starved in barns. So while food supply potentially increased due to the reduced population, actual food production plummeted. The people who were left couldn't keep up with demand, even with fewer mouths to feed. Rotting stores and empty markets. And let's talk about what was left behind. When people died, their food didn't magically preserve itself. Bread went stale, cheese spoiled, meat turned green, barrels of ale soured. In households where everyone died at once, food supplies sat untouched for weeks, sometimes months, turning into elaborate science experiments for future survivors to stumble upon. Markets, where rural farmers once brought goods to town, were silent. No sellers, no buyers, just a few stray chickens picking through the wreckage. In cities, famine and feast existed side by side. Some people looted grain stores and lived like kings. Others, without access or strength to scavenge, starved quietly in alleys. Hunger in the land of plenty. It's one of the cruelest ironies of the plague. The land was full, but the tables were empty. Why? Because infrastructure had collapsed. No wagons were running. No merchants were traveling. Roads were dangerous, sometimes impassable. Bridges were broken. Mills were idle. Food wasn't just about having it. It was about getting it to where it was needed. And when systems of exchange failed, hunger returned, sometimes even worse than before. A medieval survivor's grocery list. So what did people eat, if they could? Porridge, the eternal peasant fallback. Oats, barley, or whatever grains you could find, boiled into a lumpy mush, sometimes with herbs, rarely with flavor. Turnips and onions. These hardy root vegetables were more likely to survive neglect. If you were lucky, you could dig them from abandoned gardens. Cheese, if you had goats or cows that survived, you might still get some dairy, but without salt and proper storage, it went bad quickly. Bread, fresh loaves were rare. People relied on hard, dry remnants, soaked in broth or beer to soften them. Ale, safer than water, often more nutritious than food, sometimes the only calorie intake available. Foraged greens, nettles, wild garlic, dandelions, whatever didn't look poisonous. Whatever you could steal, scavenge, or trade, including rats. Yes, rats. Some accounts suggest desperate survivors ate rodents, birds, even dogs. Hunger doesn't care about decorum. This wasn't a gourmet age. It was survival cuisine. Whatever kept you moving long enough to not collapse next to the fire. Malnutrition and disease. A bad diet didn't just make you cranky, it made you vulnerable. Post-plague survivors often suffered from malnutrition. Without vitamin-rich foods like fresh fruits and vegetables, diseases like scurvy and rickets crept in. Weakened bodies were more prone to infections, typhoid, dysentery, and other illnesses that flourished in the unsanitary world of the aftermath. And remember, most of the food that was available had been exposed to contaminated environments. Rodent droppings, corpses, dirty hands. If you didn't die of hunger, you might die of food poisoning. New land, same old problems. In some cases, survivors gained access to abandoned farmland. Great news, right? Kind of. The land was there, but tools were missing. Seeds were old, oxen were dead, and even if you had everything you needed, you had no help. Farming is not a one-person job, and it certainly isn't easy when half the village is buried in a pit, and the other half is still coughing up black bile. So even with more land, many peasants couldn't actually use it. Or if they tried, they exhausted themselves and produced very little. The nobility still ate. Let's not forget that the elites usually managed to feed themselves just fine. Lords had stored grain. Monasteries had stockpiles. Merchants had connections. And yes, they continued to eat meat, drink wine, and hoard what little remained. Sometimes they gave alms. Sometimes they raised prices. But they were not, generally speaking, the ones eating boiled nettles in an abandoned pigsty. If anything, the plague gave them more resources, land, livestock, and the opportunity to absorb what poorer neighbors left behind. The myth of the better diet. Historians sometimes say that the diet of survivors improved, long term. That with fewer people, more protein and land became available. And in the very long run, this is kind of true. But in the short term, months, even years after the plague, people starved. People scrounged. People risked their lives for moldy crusts. And a high-protein diet sounds less impressive when it comes from chasing pigeons through ruined courtyards. You are what you eat, and you ate sadness. So what did it mean to survive the plague? It meant you ate porridge for the third time this week. You dreamed about apples. You tried not to think about the taste of real bread. You ate with your fingers because the knives were gone and the spoons were cursed. You drank warm ale and hoped it wouldn't kill you. You were alive, sure, but you were hungry, tired, and deeply sick of onions. You lived. You woke up on the cold dirt floor of your cottage. You walked outside and no one was there. You tried not to look at the pile of shallow graves in the field. You tried not to breathe too deeply. You kept walking. You lived. But now what? Survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a quieter, stranger nightmare. One that doesn't involve pustules, or death carts or screaming priests, but instead silence, loneliness, guilt, that gnawing question, why not me? Welcome to the part of plague history no one carved into cathedral walls, the emotional fallout, the psychic damage, the creeping dread that came for the survivors, long after the disease was gone. A culture that didn't understand grief. First, let's clear something up. Medieval people absolutely experienced grief. They wept, they mourned, they wrote elegies, lit candles, said prayers, but they didn't always have a framework for mental health, the way we do now. They had sin, they had divine punishment, they had penance, but they didn't have words like trauma, depression, or post-traumatic stress. So if you were walking around with a 1,000-yard stare, sobbing for no reason, or unable to speak after seeing your entire family buried in a pit, people didn't say, "You're grieving." They said, "You're troubled," or worse, cursed. Everyone's gone, and you're still here. The plague didn't just kill, it selected. Some people were spared, entire households untouched. Other families were wiped out, member by member. Over days, survivors carried that randomness like a bruise on the soul. Why did your child die, but not your neighbors? Why did you recover when the midwife, the blacksmith, and the kind old woman who gave you jam all died within hours? Was it punishment? Was it chance? Was it something worse? Medieval theology had answers. Maybe you were spared for a reason, but most people didn't feel chosen. They felt cursed, marked, unworthy. They looked at the empty bed and asked, what kind of person survives this? Ghost towns, ghost minds. The physical world reflected the emotional one. Empty houses, abandoned villages, churches with no priests, markets with no voices. It was like living in a world that had been half erased. Survivors began to behave differently. Some turned deeply inward, retreating to prayer, solitude, or silence. Others lashed out, drinking, stealing, joining violent mobs. Some believed they were being haunted. Others saw visions. Many simply stopped speaking altogether. This wasn't madness. This was unprocessed grief, hitting people who had no concept of therapy, no support systems, and no words to explain what was happening to their minds. Guilt in the eyes of God. And then there was the religious guilt. The church told people the plague was punishment, a test, a cleansing fire. So if you survived, what did that say about you? Maybe you were spared to suffer. Maybe God had plans for your penance. Or maybe, worst of all, he had overlooked you. Maybe your soul was so rotten, it wasn't even worth smiting. Survivors filled confessionals. They beat themselves in public. The flagellant movement, A mass phenomenon of people whipping themselves across Europe grew from this desperation. They weren't just afraid of God. They were trying to atone for surviving, because deep down, many believed that to live through the plague was not a blessing, it was a stain. Survivor stories that don't exist. We don't have many first-hand survivor accounts. Most medieval chronicles were written by clergy, and they focused on numbers, not feelings. They recorded the dead, not the damaged. But here and there, you see the cracks. A monk writes about those who wandered senseless from village to village, unable to rest. A merchant describes people laughing too loudly at nothing, as if touched in the head. A widow burns her entire house down and disappears into the woods. These aren't diagnoses. They're fragments of trauma, loneliness like a disease. Human beings are social creatures. Medieval life was communal. Families, guilds, parishes, feast days. To live meant to belong. And then, overnight, the social structure disintegrated. Widows with no husbands, children with no parents, elders with no one to tell stories to. Entire towns where the bells no longer rang. Survivors weren't just sad, they were alone. And for many, that was worse than illness. They lived in quiet. They ate in silence. They sang to themselves. They began to forget things, names, recipes, prayers, because there was no one left to share them with. Art, dreams, and the collapse of meaning. Survivors processed their pain the only way they could, through symbols. Art became darker. Skeletons in ball gowns. Death dancing with merchants. Tombs carved with corpses in stages of decay. They weren't just decorative, they were therapy. The dance of death, murals and macabre altar pieces were survivors screaming onto walls. In dreams, people saw loved ones returning, silent and weeping. In stories, the plague became a monster, sometimes literally, like a great beast or witch. In sermons, the line between salvation and madness blurred. And still, no one said, "You're traumatized." They said, "Pray more, fast harder, don't question God." The inheritance of pain. Survivors' guilt doesn't die with the generation that felt it. It passes on. Children raised by plague survivors often inherited their fear. They were told the world was fragile, that God was angry, that life could end at any moment. Entire communities grew up under the shadow of what we lost, and who we were before. And while the plague would return in cycles, that first wave, the Great Death, left a kind of psychic scar on Europe that never quite healed. Because survival, in this case, wasn't freedom. It was exile. From the past, from joy, from the life you were supposed to have. Alive, but never the same. You lived, you survived, but the plague took more than bodies. It took your sense of safety, your sense of meaning, your family, your future, and it left you with a bitter, fragile gift: time. Time to wander the wreckage. Time to remember what used to be. Time to carry grief for people whose names no one will ever speak again. To survive the Black Death was not to win, it was to inherit the silence. And that silence could last a lifetime. You survived the Black Death. You dug graves. You burned clothes. You whispered prayers with cracked lips. You carried the dead and you did not die. You found a way to keep living. Maybe you started rebuilding. Maybe you planted new crops. Maybe, somehow, you laughed again. And then it came back. Yes, again. Because the worst part of the plague wasn't just that it came. It was that it kept coming back. Like a ghastly, coughing guest who refuses to leave your house. You finally sweep up the ashes. And just as you exhale, knock knock. It's 1361. And the plague would like a word. The second wave, and the third, and the fourth. The Black Death of 1347-1351 was the opening act. The big one. But after that, Europe became a continent on repeat. 1361, second wave. Called the Children's Plague, because it hit the young hardest. 1369, third wave. 1374, 1400, 1438, 1456. The list goes on. Didn't happen every year, but it happened often enough that no one forgot. It was like a monstrous tide, receding only to crash down again. Each time, people hoped it would be the last. And each time, they were wrong. This wasn't a single disaster. It was an era. Imagine living in a permanent pandemic. For medieval people, Plague wasn't a historical event. It was a fact of life. If you were born in 1350 and lived a normal lifespan, you'd probably see multiple outbreaks. You'd watch your children die, then maybe your grandchildren, then maybe yourself, years after you thought the worst was over. People didn't move on from the plague. They lived with it. The way you live with a ghost in the attic. You keep the door shut. You pretend not to hear it, but you know it's there. No one knew how it worked. Modern science says it was Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas on rats. But to medieval people, the plague was unknowable. Was it the air? A punishment from God? A planetary alignment? Miasmas? Bad smells? Angry saints? Everyone had a theory. No one had a solution. So when the plague returned, people fell into the same rituals, fumigating homes with herbs, ringing bells, whipping themselves, fleeing cities. They tried astrology, bloodletting, even mass executions of scapegoats. None of it worked. The plague was a riddle they couldn't solve. And it kept asking itself, year after year. Childhood in the shadow of death. The second wave in 1361 is particularly brutal because it hits a generation that barely knows the world. Children born after the first plague now face it head-on. Some historians call this the plague generation. They never knew peace. Their lobbies were funeral chants. Their games were played in graveyards. Imagine growing up hearing that death could come any time. That if your brother coughs, he might be gone tomorrow. That God is angry, and nobody knows why. This wasn't a resilient generation. This was a generation born into trauma, and asked to keep rebuilding. Again and again. Survivors losing everything. Again. If you somehow scraped together a life after the first wave, rebuilt a home, remarried, grew food, you now had to watch it all fall apart again. Your new spouse, gone. Your toddler, gone. Your sheep, gone. Your sanity, hanging by a thread. Survivors had to grieve not once, but repeatedly. Not just the same kind of grief, but the same actual grief. Losing people who helped you survive the first time, who understood, who made life livable again. It wasn't just tragic. It was demoralizing. You weren't just surviving a disaster. You were being gaslit by fate. The normalization of death. Eventually, the plague became so common that it was folded into the calendar. Chroniclers would write things like, "In this year there was plague again, and also a good harvest." It became background noise. Just another hardship in a world that already offered war, famine, fire, and political chaos on the regular. But that normalization came at a cost. People became numb, detached. They stopped recording names of the dead. They buried without ceremony. Some stopped naming their children until they were certain they'd live. Because love, in a plague world, was a risk. The economic whiplash. Each return of the plague wasn't just a human tragedy. It was an economic migraine. Wages would rise due to labor shortages, then collapse when a new outbreak killed more workers. Land changed hands over and over. Shops opened and closed with each cycle of death. Cities tried to recover, only to shudder again. Imagine trying to plan anything, planting, marriage, trade routes, knowing the plague might undo it all. There was no stability, only anxiety. People didn't build for the future. They built for right now, because the future might get a fever and die next Thursday. Art and culture. Death is the muse. By the 15th century, Europe's art had absorbed this constant death. Skeletons became permanent figures, dancing, preaching, even making love. The dance macabre was everywhere, reminding people, death doesn't care if you're a king or a shepherd. Literature, too, turned fatalistic. Stories began with, "Everyone dies," and worked backward from there. Even church music adopted a mournful tone, chanting not in celebration, but in weary resignation. This wasn't a dark phase. This was life. Building a life on shifting ground. For plague survivors, hope was fragile. You could never be sure it was safe to love, or plant, or sing too loudly. Everything felt provisional, like it might be taken away. Some responded with religious fervor, others with hedonism. Some turned inward, others lashed out. But nearly all carried a quiet knowledge. This could happen again. And next time, you might not be lucky. Survival wasn't a ticket to safety. You didn't get a medal. You didn't get immunity. Surviving one plague wave was no guarantee you'd survive the next. And that was the final insult. The plague didn't just kill once. It haunted your doorstep. It scratched at the shutters. And just when you dared to feel safe, it knocked again. So yes, you lived. But in a world where the plague could return any time, survival wasn't a triumph. It was a delay. You're living in the aftermath of the greatest biological disaster in human history. Your neighbors are dead. The graveyard is full. You're out of onions. And the plague might come back next week. You want answers. You want protection. You want something, anything, to believe in. And so, naturally, you turn to a dried frog worn around the neck. Welcome to the world of medieval superstition, where desperation met imagination and gave birth to the weirdest medical revolution you never asked for. Medicine had no clue. Let's be clear. Medieval medicine was already bad before the plague. Doctors still believed in humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Illness was an imbalance. Diagnosis was mostly guesswork. Treatment was leeches, bleeding, purging, or herbal syrups made by someone's cousin, who once studied in Salerno. Now throw the Black Death into this mix, a disease that killed in days, spread invisibly, and laughed in the face of all known cures. The result? Total collapse of medical confidence. Physicians didn't just fail, they fled. They locked their doors, left cities, or died trying to treat others. Those who remained offered remedies like sitting between two roaring fires to burn the disease out, drinking crushed emeralds mixed with wine, avoiding baths because water opened the pores to evil, placing chopped onions around the house to soak up plague vapors. Spoiler, none of it worked. But when science fails, belief rushes in. God, punishment, and desperate penance. The church interpreted the plague as divine retribution. You sinned, society sinned, everyone sinned. So if the disease was punishment, the solution had to be spiritual. That's how you ended up with things like public flagellations, processions of barefoot penitents whipping themselves bloody to earn God's forgiveness, mass prayers, bells rung, processions held, churches packed with coughing penitents, banning laughter because joy was inappropriate while God was angry, blaming minorities. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, tortured, exiled, massacred. These weren't just religious acts. They were attempts to control a world gone mad. If the plague came from sin, then repentance became the new medicine. Holy relics and magical amulets. With traditional medicine in shambles, survivors turned to physical objects of power. Saints' bones, believed to protect entire towns. Pieces of the true cross, often sold by the dozen. Medallions with holy inscriptions, often worn around the neck or hung in homes. Plague charms, tiny bags filled with herbs, scripture, or animal parts. Some wore frogs or snakeskins as amulets. Others carried dried toads in their pockets. One popular charm included a scrap of parchment with the words, abracadabra, written in a triangle. Yes, abracadabra. Not just a stage trick. Originally a protective charm against fever and death. These weren't seen as silly. They were lifelines. When the devil knocks, you grab whatever shield you can find, even if it's a piece of mummified lizard stapled to your underpants. Astrology and the plague of the stars. Many believed the stars had cursed them. A famous theory from 1348 claimed the plague was caused by the conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter. So people turned to astrologers and horoscopes to predict outbreaks, diagnose illnesses, and even choose safe travel days. Doctors used star charts to time surgeries. Peasants prayed under certain moons. Nobles consulted sky watchers before deciding whether to hold court. This wasn't mysticism, it was Plan B. If God wasn't answering, maybe the stars were. Plague doctors, half medicine, half theater. One of the most iconic figures of the post-plague world is the plague doctor. Black robes, gloves, wide-brimmed hat, and that nightmarish beaked mask. Inside the beak, aromatic herbs, garlic, vinegar-soaked sponges. The mask wasn't just spooky, it was supposed to filter out bad air, miasma, that carried disease. Were they effective? Not really. Were they terrifying? Absolutely. The costume was both practical, to avoid touching the sick, and performative, to show that something was being done. In truth, plague doctors were often not trained physicians, but hired bodies. Sometimes even criminals offered a pardon in exchange for tending the ill. Imagine being sick and your doctor walks in looking like a bird demon with a meat cleaver. It did not inspire confidence. Folk healers and witchcraft. In the chaos, folk healers stepped in, where doctors vanished. Midwives, herbalists, and local wise women offered potions, salves, and spells. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they were accused of witchcraft. As superstition grew, so did fear of those who used unapproved methods. A woman with too much knowledge of herbs might be praised one week and burned the next, because in a world where death lurked behind every sneeze, suspicion became survival, superstition became structure. Eventually, many of these beliefs solidified into routine. You didn't wait for plague to strike, you lived as if it was already here. You hung garlic by the door. You whispered protective prayers before sleep. You avoided strangers and covered your mouth with flowers. You never touched coins without washing them in vinegar. It wasn't just habit, it was identity. A plague survivor was part priest, part mystic, part walking pharmacy. And if none of it worked, well, at least you were doing something. When prayer becomes medicine, the ultimate lesson of the age wasn't about health, it was about control. When you can't fight a thing, you ritualize it. You build a system of belief around it. You turn chaos into habit. Prayer became prescription. Superstition became survival strategy. And medicine, such as it was, became theater, equal parts hope and herbs. Did it work? Not really. But in a time where corpses lined the streets and medicine had no answers, belief, however strange, was all many had left. And that belief was strong enough to get them out of bed each morning. Even if the frogs were watching, you survived. You buried the sick. You boiled your clothes. You prayed, wept, and waited. Finally, the plague ended. You were still standing. Your heart was beating. So you returned to your village. And nobody wanted you there. Because here's the bitter truth about surviving a plague in the Middle Ages. Survival didn't win you applause. It didn't earn you a parade. It got you whispers, cold shoulders, and suspicious glances. You weren't seen as lucky, you were seen as contaminated. You were, in the eyes of many, damaged goods. Fear was a permanent feature. After the initial devastation of the Black Death, fear didn't just fade, it calcified. People learned to associate others, especially strangers, and survivors, with danger. You coughed. Suspicious. You were gone during the worst of it. Probably cursed. You came back to healthy. Probably a sorcerer. Survivors returning to their homes or cities often found that fear greeted them before any family did. They were asked, "Where have you been? Are you still infected? Why are you alive when others died?" Surviving the plague wasn't evidence of strength. It was evidence of suspicion. Stigma as self-protection. In a pre-germ theory world, people didn't understand disease transmission, but they understood patterns. People who had been near the sick often got sick, so anyone associated with plague-stricken areas became a walking red flag. Returning survivors faced quarantines, locked in their homes for 40 days, even if they had no symptoms. Exile, barred from towns entirely, forced to live on roadsides or in woods. Forced isolation, refused entry into guilds, churches, and public markets. Sometimes, families wouldn't even let their own members come home. A brother might return to find his parents had moved away. A wife might knock on her own door and hear the bolt slide into place. The reek of plague. Even if you were healthy, you might carry the aura of plague. People believed the illness lingered in clothes, in hair, in breath. Survivors were told to burn their belongings, wash in vinegar, sleep outside for a week, shave their heads. Some were advised to confess publicly, just in case God had spared them for now, but intended future punishment. If you didn't, your neighbors might handle it for you. There are accounts of returning survivors being attacked, their homes burned, or their animals killed, just to cleanse the area. Plague wasn't just a disease, it was a taint, and survivors were treated like they hadn't fully washed it off. Clean versus unclean. Medieval social hygiene. The language of plague borrowed heavily from religion. Survivors were often seen as spiritually unclean, even if their bodies were whole. In some places, local governments required returning plague victims to wear identifiable clothing. In others, they had to carry certificates of health, signed by local clergy, primitive health passports proving they weren't cursed or still contagious. You could be completely healthy and still be banned from marrying into certain families, owning property, working in communal trades, like bakeries or cloth making, attending church or festivals. Medieval society didn't run on kindness. It ran on reputation. And yours, dear survivor, was in the mud. The lonely return. Imagine this. You survive. You walk back into your village. You knock on the door of your childhood home. You're thin, shaking, carrying the last of your food. And your brother looks at you through the crack in the door and says, "You shouldn't be here." This happened not just once, repeatedly. Across Europe, survivors found themselves shut out, not because people hated them, but because people were terrified of them. Rebuilding was hard enough. Rebuilding alone, almost impossible. Some survivors became wanderers. Others joined marginal communities, outlaws, lepers, even traveling mystics. They were no longer part of the fabric of daily life. They had been unwoven. Gossip, rumors, and supernatural suspicions. Human beings love stories. And when something terrifying happens, we make up lots of them. So when someone survived the plague while others died, neighbors began whispering. Did they make a deal with the devil? Did they poison the well? Did they practice some kind of black magic? In a few tragic cases, survivors were accused of causing the plague through sorcery, especially women who lived alone or had herbal knowledge. Some were interrogated, tortured, or burned, because nothing makes you more suspicious in a plague-racked town than being too alive. Survivor as outsider. This stigma wasn't just personal, it became institutional. Survivors returning to religious life were sometimes denied communion. Survivors re-entering monastic orders were isolated for weeks, even months. In cities, guilds required additional purification rites before reinstating anyone who had been away during plague times. In some places, survivors had to swear oaths under God that they were not harboring disease in their bodies. This wasn't about science. This was about fear becoming policy. And it meant that many people who survived the plague died socially, cut off, untrusted, unwanted. A lifetime of sideways looks. Even years later, plague survivors often lived with the shadow of what they'd endured. It was etched into their reputations. The woman who lost her family must be cursed. The man who came back alone probably brought it with him. The child who didn't get sick might not even be human. Medieval memory was long and judgmental, especially in small communities, where the same faces showed up year after year, carrying the same old suspicions. You could survive the fever, but good luck surviving the gossip. Rejection in a world that needed you. The tragedy of the plague was that it killed so many, yet the survivors weren't embraced as heroes. They were treated as liabilities. And this, perhaps, was the cruelest irony. After all the loss, the disease, the despair, after enduring what no one should have to endure, the world you returned to didn't say, "Welcome back." It said, "Prove you're clean." And it never stopped asking. You survived the plague. You found your way back. Maybe your house was still standing. Maybe your neighbors still recognized you. But something had changed. They didn't smile. They didn't hug you. They didn't say, "Thank God you made it." They asked where you'd been. They asked if you were safe. And they asked, sometimes outright, if you brought it back with you. Because by the time the plague rolled through Europe, again and again, it had burned away more than lives. It burned away trust. And in its place, it left suspicion. Cold, hollow-eyed, bitter suspicion that seeped into everything from families to governments. When everyone's a suspect. Before the plague, people generally trusted institutions, the church, the guilds, even the town doctor, who treated your cough with mint and leeches. You might have hated the local tax collector, but you assumed he wasn't trying to kill you. After the plague, every person, every institution, every traveler was a potential vector of death. You didn't trust your neighbors, your priest, your spouse, foreigners, Jews, beggars, merchants, strangers, barbers, even doctors. People began to look at each other differently. A cough could clear a room. A sneeze could get you chased out of town. Every interaction became a gamble. Every act of closeness became a risk. And in that climate, trust wasn't just fragile, it was dangerous. Families turned inward or against each other. One of the most horrifying truths of the plague years was how it tore apart families. There are first-hand accounts of children abandoning dying parents, of spouses locking each other in rooms, of people nailing their relatives inside houses to prevent spread, not because they were cruel, but because they were terrified. As Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, brother abandoned brother, uncle nephew, wife husband, and, what is more incredible and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children. If the people who loved you most could become infected, could you really trust them? If they started coughing, would you run? The death of community. Villages that once thrived on shared labor and seasonal festivals became tense, quiet, and isolated. Church attendance dropped in plague times, not just out of fear of crowds, but because people no longer trusted priests who couldn't protect them. Markets, the heart of community life, became paranoid spaces. Merchants wore gloves. Buyers avoided touching goods. Coins were soaked in vinegar or passed through slits in doors. The small courtesies of life, helping a neighbor carry water, greeting travelers, sharing bread, became acts of recklessness. And where generosity died, fear took its place. Travel became a red flag. Before the plague, being a traveler meant you brought news, goods, spices, or maybe songs from another land. After the plague, travel meant risk. Many towns required papers proving you'd been in a clean zone. Some erected barricades or hired guards to block roads. Travelers were stopped, questioned, inspected, sometimes stripped, sometimes attacked. Even letters were suspect. Some cities banned the mail entirely during outbreaks. They believed written messages could carry disease through the air trapped in parchment, so people stopped moving. And when they did move, others watched them like hawks, because the road wasn't a path anymore. It was a threat. The rise of conspiracy thinking. As society reeled from repeated outbreaks, people began looking for someone to blame. They blamed the Jews, poisoning wells, lepers, spreading disease through touch, foreigners, carrying strange miasmas, witches, cursing crops and children, women, especially widows who survived. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were mainstream. Entire communities were massacred on suspicion alone. The idea that the plague was caused by people, not just God or nature, took root. And once that seed was planted, it blossomed into generations of scapegoating. If your village was spared, you were lucky. If you were spared, people wondered what you had done to make a deal with death. Governments respond with paranoia. Medieval authorities didn't trust the public either. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Milan developed early quarantine systems. They created pest houses to isolate the sick, required travel permits, and posted plague inspectors in neighborhoods. It sounds organized, but it was also deeply paranoid. People were fined or arrested for hosting travelers. Houses were boarded up with the sick still inside. Rumors led to preemptive burnings of homes, goods, and even entire streets. This wasn't public health. It was crowd control, fear control. Trust in leadership eroded, because when death's on the doorstep, no one wants to believe anyone's in charge. Even the dead were suspect. Plague didn't just change how the living treated each other. It changed how they treated the dead. Before the Black Death, funerals were community events. Prayers, mourning clothes, candles, shared grief. After the Black Death, burials became rushed, anonymous, and often done at night. Graves were mass pits. Priests stood far back, muttering rites quickly. Mourners stayed away. Touching the dead was seen as suicidal. Even corpses were suspicious. And when you fear the dead, you lose more than community. You lose closure. You lose ritual. You lose the trust that death, at least, can be done with dignity. The psychological toll. All of this suspicion took a toll. Children grew up seeing neighbors shunned or killed. Survivors became secretive, avoidant, emotionally distant. People learned not to help, not to touch, not to speak freely. Isolation became the norm. This wasn't just social decay. It was a generation-wide trauma response. People adapted by pulling inward. They stopped investing in each other. They stopped trusting good news. They learned to assume the worst, and sometimes, they were right. It was the safest way to live, but it made living feel very empty. A fragile, fractured world. The medieval world was already harsh, but after the plague, it became suspicious by design. Laws assumed dishonesty. Neighbors assumed treachery. Institutions assumed blame. Survivors assumed they'd be abandoned again. And in that world, the cost of survival wasn't just grief. It was loneliness. Because when trust dies, civilization begins to hollow out. And what's left? A few scared people, with vinegar on their hands, and locks on their hearts. The bodies weren't even cold, and someone was already figuring out how to make money off them. The plague destroyed lives, families, towns, entire economies. But where most saw ruin, a clever few saw opportunity. And while the rest of the medieval world wept, prayed, and dug graves, these people made deals, took property, raised prices, and walked off richer than before. Congratulations, you survived the plague. Now meet the people who got rich from it. Supply and demand. Death creates shortages. First, a bit of medieval economics. When the Black Death killed nearly half the population of Europe, it didn't just leave empty houses and open graves. It left job openings. Fields went untended, shops closed, markets vanished. There simply weren't enough living people to do the work of the dead, and those who remained, suddenly, they were valuable. A farmhand who used to earn scraps could now demand wages. A weaver might be offered twice her usual rate. A grave digger, practically a celebrity. There was now a labor shortage everywhere, but not everyone was interested in fairness. Some people used the chaos to charge outrageous prices, hoard essentials, or exploit desperate survivors. Grave diggers and body collectors. You'd think burying plague victims would be the worst job imaginable. You'd be right. But also, it paid. So-called plague buriers became a strange new class of essential worker. Some were paid by the corpse. Others took bribes from families to give their loved ones a decent burial instead of tossing them into mass graves. And since most of them worked alone or unsupervised, corruption spread like plague. There are accounts of grave workers stealing valuables from corpses, extorting fees from desperate mourners, faking burials and dumping bodies elsewhere, demanding extra pay for hurry jobs. It was dangerous. It was disgusting. But if you could stomach it, and didn't mind robbing the dead, you could make a living, sometimes a very good one. Land grabs and property sharks. With so many people dead, land suddenly became available. A merchant dies. His house is up for grabs. A noble family vanishes. Their estate sits empty. Inheritance laws were often ignored. Records were lost. The courts were overwhelmed. So who stepped in? Opportunistic relatives, local officials, schemers who forged wills or found deeds, neighbors who just moved in and claimed squatters' rights. In some cases, entire villages were resettled by strangers who seized control of empty property. And let's not forget the church, often the biggest landowner in medieval Europe. When chaos reigned, monasteries and bishops absorbed land for safekeeping, and they didn't always give it back. Medical charlatans and plague cures. The more frightened the public became, the more snake oil salesmen showed up. With no working medicine and an entire continent in terror, people were willing to buy anything. So here's what the opportunists offered. Potions guaranteed to repel the pestilence. Amulets made from blessed relics, reed, cow bones. Candles soaked in protective oils. Pills containing ground-up gemstones. Beak masks for filtering bad air. Mass-produced knockoffs. Some of these hucksters sold their wares in markets. Others went door to door, pretending to be healers. Some were genuine doctors trying to help, but many were just thieves with aprons. They didn't need to cure anyone. They just needed to sell before the buyer died, which, in plague times, was usually very soon. Monopolies on misery. Some people didn't dig graves or hawk miracle powders. They just used their resources to corner the market. Examples: bakers who doubled bread prices overnight. Apothecaries who bought up herbs and sold tiny portions at absurd rates. Butchers who refused to sell meat without danger pay. Cloth merchants who sold funeral shrouds for 10 times the normal price. These were everyday people, neighbors, friends, guild members, who suddenly realized, wait, I can charge anything, and they'll pay it, because the alternative was death. And so, the cost of everything went up: food, tools, wood for coffins, even candles for prayers. Survival became expensive, and someone was always making change. Priests and pardons, pay to pray. The church wasn't always innocent, either. With so many deaths, demand for last rites, burials, and prayers for the dead skyrocketed. And while many clergy risked their lives to serve the dying, others turned grief into gold. They sold special indulgences for plague victims, priority funerals and consecrated ground, holy water, blessed by bishops, actually just river water, protective prayers for a price. If you wanted your mother buried properly, you had to pay. If you wanted your soul to skip purgatory, you had to donate. And if you were poor, well, God would understand. Right. Rent rises and tax tricks. For peasants who survived, the plague offered a small ray of hope. Labor was rare, so maybe they could bargain for better conditions. But landlords had other ideas. Many landowners raised rents sharply, demanded new fees for basic rights, like using the mill or well, declared old contracts void because times had changed, fined survivors for relatives who hadn't paid taxes before they died, and if you didn't like it, you could leave. Except where would you go? The other lords were doing the same thing. The law backed the landowners. The crown often supported them, because kings were also desperate for taxes, armies, and control. So much for opportunity. Profiteering became normal as the plague returned in waves. 1348, 1361, 1374, 1400. Each outbreak brought a new generation of opportunists. The idea of making money from sickness stuck. By the 15th century, entire industries existed around plague. Plague hospitals, plague burial teams, plague wardens and guards, plague insurance. And while the poor died in droves, someone always found a way to get rich. Because tragedy might not be fair, but it can be profitable. Bitterness among the survivors. Survivors who lost everything saw their neighbors thrive. A man who buried 6 children saw a merchant buy a second house. A widow forced to beg saw her priest commission a new silver cross. And what grew in the shadow of grief and survival? Resentment. Because it wasn't just that you survived. It was that someone benefited from your pain. And in the long quiet of the plague years, while the bells tolled and the graveyards grew, you had plenty of time to notice who was selling garlic at 4 times the price, and who was laughing all the way to the counting house. What if you survived but you were only 7 years old? Your village is quiet now. Too quiet. Your mother doesn't come when you call. Your father hasn't been seen in days. The food is gone. The fire's out. The dog ran away. You're alive. Somehow. But everyone who kept you safe, your family, your neighbors, your whole world, is just gone. Now what? This was the reality for thousands of children after the Black Death. They survived the sickness, only to face a childhood of abandonment, hunger, trauma, and exploitation. Surviving the plague as a child didn't mean growing up. It meant growing up without anyone to help you. Orphaned by the plague. The scale was unimaginable. The plague killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. Entire families vanished overnight. That left hundreds of thousands of children orphaned. Some were lucky, taken in by relatives or neighbors, but many were simply left. They lived in empty houses. They wandered ruined villages. They followed death carts, crying. They knocked on church doors begging for food. And not all were toddlers. Some were adolescents, old enough to survive, too young to thrive. There were no child services, no orphanages as we know them, just frightened kids in a dead world, trying to stay fed and warm. The foundlings and wives. Medieval records are filled with vague, sorrowful terms: foundling, waif, stray, illegitimate, and claimed. These were often children whose parents died of plague. Many wound up in monasteries or nunneries, as servants, not students. Noble households, as unpaid labor. Farmsteads, as plowboys or milkmaids. The streets, as beggars, thieves, or worse. They were fed, sometimes clothed, but rarely loved, rarely taught, rarely allowed to just be children. Because after the plague, childhood was a luxury society could no longer afford. Legal orphans, economic property. If a child survived but their family didn't, they were often declared a ward of the state or of the church. This meant their property could be taken for safekeeping. A local lord or priest could make decisions on their behalf. They might be married off at 11 or 12 to seal an alliance. They had no real say in their future. Survivors were often treated less like people and more like inheritances. In some towns, property disputes were settled not by asking what the child wanted, but by auctioning off their home and placing them in whichever family bid lowest to care for them. Child labor boom. With so many adults gone, entire industries needed fresh labor. Guess who filled the gap? Children. They were sent to work in fields from dawn until dusk, given jobs in dangerous urban trades, weaving, dyeing, tanning, hired out by the church or state as plague apprentices, used as messengers, errand runners, chimney sweeps, even corpse collectors. Some kids earned wages, small ones. Most didn't. Many were abused. Some simply disappeared, because in a broken world, Child safety wasn't a priority. Productivity was. Emotional fallout. Grief with no words. Let's pause here. Imagine what it meant to be 7, 8, 10 years old, and suddenly, you're alone. You don't understand what happened. You just know your parents are gone. You don't know if it's safe to cry, or who will help you if you do. You learn fast. Don't ask questions. Don't expect comfort. Don't trust adults. Don't get attached. Plagued children grew up fast. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They learned how to cook, clean, barter, beg, steal, hide. They learned how to survive, but not how to heal. Childhood itself changed. Before the plague, childhood was already short. Most kids started working by age 7, but there was still a sense of transition, of protection, of family structure. After the plague, those boundaries collapsed. Kids took on adult roles before they were ready. Some became heads of household. Some were married off just to keep land in the family. Others were simply left to fend for themselves. The concept of a carefree childhood, it didn't survive the Black Death. What emerged instead was a generation of traumatized survivors. And they passed that trauma on. The rise of street children. Cities like Florence, London, and Paris saw spikes in vagrant children after each plague wave. They begged, they scavenged, they formed small groups for safety. Some were absorbed into criminal networks, used to pick pockets, run messages, or carry stolen goods. They were rarely punished by law, not because the courts were kind, but because they didn't know what to do with so many unwanted, unparented children. And sometimes, just sometimes, a few disappeared into monasteries, not because they wanted to become monks, but because they wanted a bed and food. That was the bar. Forgotten by history. We don't know many names. We don't have many stories. These children didn't leave diaries, but we find them in records. A child listed as the only surviving heir in a will. A nameless boy apprenticed to a tanner at age 8. A girl taken into a nunnery with the note, "From plague household." A group of 7 orphans found huddled behind the bakery. They didn't become famous. They didn't write books. They simply lived, if they could. They were the silent foundation of Europe's rebuilding, and nobody really thanked them for it. A childhood without closure. Some of these plagued children grew up. They married. They had children. They rebuilt villages, farms, cities. But deep down, many never recovered, because when your first memories are of mass graves and empty homes, when your first lesson is that the people you love disappear, you carry that into everything. And that kind of survival, it's not just sad, it's scarring. The bell stopped ringing, the cart stopped rolling, the smoke cleared, the dead were buried. The plague had passed, this wave, at least. But now you're standing in a field, or a church, or an empty house, and everything's different. Everyone's gone, and the world expects you to keep going, like this is just over. But grief doesn't vanish when the symptoms do. It lingers. It warps things. It builds little nests in your heart and waits. Medieval plague survivors didn't just carry scars. They carried hauntings. Emotional, psychological, even spiritual. The plague changed the shape of their minds as much as their world. Let's talk about the long grief, the survivor's guilt. Let's begin with the simplest, darkest question. Why me? Why did you survive when your sister died screaming? Why did your town vanish but your house remained untouched? Some people found comfort in religion. Others found confusion or fury. And that quiet guilt, it wormed its way into their sleep. Because surviving isn't always a victory. It can feel like an accident. Or worse, like a punishment. You were the one left behind to remember, haunted by sounds and smells. Grief isn't abstract when you live in a world without therapy or understanding. It comes back in senses. Survivors often described sudden terror at the sound of coughing, panic attacks when they smelled incense used at plague burials, cold sweats when they saw black hoods or red crosses, nightmares about bells tolling endlessly. Some feared opening doors. Others avoided certain streets for the rest of their lives. One woman in Avignon refused to ever touch bread again after losing her husband in a bread line during quarantine. Grief rewired their senses, and no one called it trauma. They just called it life. Rituals of remembrance or avoidance. The church stepped in to provide comfort. Masses for the dead, prayer books, candles, indulgences. But for many survivors, no ritual could match the weight of their loss. Some lit candles every week for the rest of their lives. Others built tiny roadside shrines, where relatives had collapsed. Some refused to speak the names of the dead at all. A few even left the church altogether, furious that God had allowed such horror. One monk wrote, "I buried 50 in a single day. I do not sing anymore." When grief breaks faith, what replaces it? Survivors as ghosts themselves. Many survivors weren't welcomed back. They were seen as carriers. People whispered, avoided, crossed themselves. Imagine losing everything, and then being treated like a curse. In some villages, plague survivors moved to the margins, physically and socially, excluded from feasts or markets, denied marriage due to bad luck, branded with quiet suspicion. They lived through it. What did they see? What did they do? They became like living ghosts, present, but not embraced. Their grief had no place to land. Artistic echoes, death in every frame. After the plague, Europe's art changed. Pre-plague, it had been bright, devotional, idealized. Afterward, skeletons dancing with bishops, dance macabre, grim reapers whispering to peasants, virgins surrounded by plague sores. Jesus depicted bleeding from plague wounds. The message was clear: death is always near. This wasn't just art, it was catharsis, a way to name the nameless horror, a way to say, we haven't forgotten, because forgetting felt impossible. The psychological collapse. Some survivors cracked. We know of hermits who went into the woods and never returned, widows who wore mourning clothes for the rest of their lives, priests who stopped speaking altogether, towns that held plague anniversary processions every year in silence. What we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, isolation, rage, emotional numbness, was common, but there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no understanding. People called it melancholy, madness, possession. Sometimes they were punished, sometimes pitied, rarely healed, because the body might recover from plague. The mind often didn't. The generational grief. The people who survived passed their grief on to their children, not by choice, but by sheer presence. Children raised in silent households, villages that banned music or feasts out of respect, stories told only in whispers, if at all, widows who never remarried, refusing to replace the dead. The next generation grew up in a shadow world, marked not by what was there, but what had been lost. A world built by survivors, but shaped by absence. A different kind of apocalypse. The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic. It was a psychological apocalypse. It made people question the reliability of their senses, the value of their memories, the justice of their gods, the point of hope. And those questions didn't vanish when the graves filled in. They lingered for years, for decades, until entire cultures learned to live with loss, not just as a memory, but as a way of life. Survival isn't the end of the story. Here's the most important truth. To survive the plague wasn't to beat it. It was to carry it. Every cough afterward felt suspicious. Every fever brought dread. Every moment of peace felt borrowed. And the grief. It was always there. Behind the eyes. In the quiet. In the way people touched less. Spoke less. Hoped less. Because when you survive something that kills half the world, you don't rebuild your life. You live among the ruins. The plague ended. Not all at once, not with fireworks or declarations. It simply faded. 1 year, fewer coughs. The next, fewer carts. By the century's end, death still visited, but not as loudly. And Europe looked around and realized, nothing is the same. And it never would be again. Survivors didn't just rebuild. They remade the world, not out of vision, but out of necessity, trauma, rage, and sheer human stubbornness. Here's what plague survival left behind. For better or worse, the collapse of feudalism. Before the plague, European society was held up by a delicate pyramid: kings, nobles, knights, peasants. After the plague, the base crumbled. Too many peasants had died. Too much land sat empty. Too few workers remained to keep the old system running. Survivors demanded higher wages, better treatment, legal protections, freedom to move where they please. Some lords tried to force them back into old roles. It didn't work. England even passed laws capping wages and imprisoning wandering laborers. But the genie was out of the bottle. People had tasted leverage, and they never forgot it. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it helped kill feudalism. New wealth, new classes. With fewer people, surviving families often inherited a lot, land, livestock, tools, sometimes entire businesses. This gave rise to a new middle class. Not nobles, not peasants, but but somewhere in between. Merchants, guildmasters, traders, landowners. People who had lost everything, and then found themselves holding the keys to the future. Cities boomed, markets shifted, trade routes reopened, and for the first time in centuries, someone who wasn't born noble could start to live like one, all thanks to a pandemic. A shift in spirituality. Faith didn't disappear after the plague, but it changed. Some people leaned harder into religion, desperate for meaning. More monasteries were built. More people gave donations for the souls of the dead. Processions, pilgrimages, and doomsday cults surged. Others turned away from the church. Why? Because priests had fled, clergy had extorted the grieving, prayers hadn't saved anyone. This growing doubt laid the groundwork for what would come later. The Reformation, the rise of personal faith, the weakening of the church stranglehold. It didn't happen because of plague alone, but plague cracked the foundations. The rise of the individual. Before the Black Death, you were mostly your role, a baker, a serf, a monk, a wife. Afterward, people began asking, what if I'm more than that? Survival made people aware of their own identity, choices, even mortality. Art became more personal. Wills became more common. Tomb inscriptions started telling stories, not just names. This tiny, radical shift toward individualism was one of the plague's quietest legacies, and it changed the West forever. The birth of public health. Medieval medicine was mostly guesswork, but the Black Death forced a rethink. Cities began experimenting with quarantines. The word comes from quaranta, meaning 40 days. Isolation wards. Cleanliness ordinances. Plague doctors, ineffective, but a start. Municipal boards to track illness. Venice led the way. Other cities followed. It didn't save everyone. It barely worked, but it was something, and it planted the idea that disease was not just divine punishment, but a public issue that needed public solutions. The seed of the Renaissance. Here's a strange irony. From mass death came creative rebirth. The years after the plague saw a burst of innovation in art and architecture, renewed interest in classical texts, experiments in perspective, anatomy, realism, a deep, strange obsession with death and time. Would the Renaissance have happened without the Black Death? Possibly, but it happened faster because of it. A world that had seen so much loss was ready to express, in stone, paint, and verse, what it meant to be alive. The culture of death. But not all legacies were positive. The Black Death left behind a cultural obsession with mortality. Hourglasses on tombs. Skeletons in tapestries. Literature filled with rot, decay, and divine reckoning. Children's lobbies with lyrics about graves and bells. This wasn't just macabre fashion. It was the coping mechanism of an entire continent. A reminder burned into the collective memory. You will die. And that memory lingered. For centuries, a changed relationship with time. Before the plague, time was cyclical. Seasons, church feasts, crop rotations. After the plague, time felt fragile. People started keeping better records, marking dates of deaths and births, writing wills, even at young ages, building monuments, lest they be forgotten. The medieval obsession with legacy, tombs, inscriptions, family names, grew stronger, because now everyone knew the end could come any day, and they wanted to be remembered when it did. Not just survival, transformation. In the end, the survivors didn't just return to life as it was. They reshaped Europe by accident, by trauma, by need. Their grief became law. Their memories became paintings. Their panic became policy. And even now, centuries later, we're still living in a world partly built by people who lost everything and kept going anyway. They survived, and in doing so, they changed history.